Earthlings, welcome along to another vegan time tunnel. So we're starting off a three-parter, really, provided I can find all the materials, on the North American animal movement. So this is part one of that, and so looking forward to that. Now, also, let me say that both Ronnie and I received some nice feedback from the special we did on Tuesday. So that was a Time Tunnel and Still Alive special on an activist called Neil Lee. So if you want to check that out, then please do so. But we had some really nice feedback from that. We both knew Neil. Okay, so as ever then, with people who might be tuning in outside of my YouTube, if you want to see the chat, then if you switch over to that. If you do comment on Facebook, I will be able to see it, but you won't be able to see everybody else's comments, including any replies to yourself. And then, of course, it's very important, for you to comment, and you'll never get charged for putting the comments on the screen as well. So don't you worry about that. Should you be fretting, as it were. Now, another issue is that I've had quite a lot of I've been doing a lot of nursing of a sick cat today. So if the show's a bit incoherent, it's a little bit due to that, because I've not really had the last kind of zip through my notes as I normally do. So welcome then to another vegan time tunnel. Yes, so the North American animal movement, part one of three, hopefully. Now, there's quite a lot of resources that I'm using, because obviously quite a lot of the time tunnels, they've either involved myself or they've been around about a time that I knew about and everything. So in that sense, it's all kind of a bit British based. And so these ones are getting into the, the North American scene, which is obviously important to see how the two places interact, if you like. So there's quite a lot of resources involved. So let me run through what I'm using. There's Finson and Finson on the right there. That's one of the main sources that we're going to be using today. And also the Rainbow Out Thunder. We'll probably get onto that more in the second and third edition. So you can kind of regard these resources as for the three programs, if you like. The Susan Sperlin one there, Animal Liberators, is quite interesting. This person is pro-vivisection, so this is her take, if you like, on the movement. It's always interesting to see. Hello from New York. Hello, Philip. How are you doing? Also, the Guther book. I've used that a lot in my academic work. Animal Rights, the History and Scope of Radical Social Movement. But the interesting thing about it is that Guther is a professor of, he's got an interest in animal welfare. So that's where he's kind of coming from. There's quite a lot of that, really, in terms of who comments on the movement. A lot of them will take the lead from a kind of a welfare position. The Waves of Protest is a general text book, but it's got a chapter by James Jasper in it. And also the book on the right is James Jasper himself and Dorothy Nelkin. So Jasper and Nelkin is a kind of very well-known book in terms of the movement. Now, one interesting thing I always like to point out is this little insert here. This is if I go back, you can see it's a little insert from the picture on the book. Now, in Waves of Protest, what Jasper talks about is moral shocks. And so the difference in recruiting for social movements or social organizations, two of the main differences is either moral shocking or networking. And we tend to concentrate on moral shocks. And this kind of thing is an example, which is really quite interesting, kind of sociologically, but also from a movement history point of view. So this person has a banner saying, "Take a closer look. Need we say more?" Right? And so this kind of idea is still prevalent in the modern day movement, because if you were to say to the person, "Yes, I need you to say more," she would say, "Well, look, take a closer look." And then if you respond by saying, "Yes, but I want you to say more about the issue," she would probably respond, "Well, look, take another look." And so we have a lot of that in the modern movement, in the sense of, well, what's the problem? Well, look at the screen. Well, what's the issue? Well, look what's going on the screen. And the kind of theoretical issue there is that we as a movement seem to have lost the ability to make the case for animal rights, or even the case for animal liberation in the Peter Singer sense. And so we do rely on the moral shock part of it. And we go, well, just look how terrible it is, and then you'll understand. Whereas some people, they want you to be able to explain the case for animal rights. And it's interesting in the sense that we don't seem to be able to do that too well. And we get around that by just asking people basically just to look at pictures and to look at video screens. Okay, Animals, Men and Morals. This is from 1971. Kind of fairly famous book in the movement now, I guess. Issues in Green Criminology. I put that in really because I've got a chapter in there about my time when I was on something called, what was it called? Animal Rights Debate. It was one of those kind of early internet forums. And it was really quite interesting. There was a few animal advocates there, and there's quite a few people from counter movements. In particular, there's a group called the National Animal Interest Alliance, and there's quite a few of their representatives on this thing. Now, they were desperate for Peter Singer to be regarded as an animal rights person. So Lee Hall was on this forum, explaining to them that Singer is not an animal rights person, as we know he isn't, right? But they just wouldn't accept it, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to associate animal rights with some of Singer's more controversial ideas about infants, etc., etc. All the stuff that he was getting protested about in North America at the time. We talk about the 1990s here. One person, for example, I pointed out that Singer himself said that he wasn't an animal rights person. And she wrote back saying, "Oh, so just because Singer says he's not animal rights, that means he's not animal rights, ? Kind of thing." And you're going, well, poor old Singer can't really win here, in the sense that he's pleaded for years that he's not animal rights, and yet nobody will believe him on either side of the movement counter movement debate, if you like. So that's why that's in there. There's a couple of new ones, relatively new ones. So this Vegetarian in America, it's an interesting history. There's a lot. I had a quick look in the index today. References to Peter Singer, references to animal liberation, nothing about Tom Reagan, and nothing about the case for animal rights, which is pretty kind of standard in this. The same would probably be true with the Norm Phelps book, although I do think he does talk about the difference between Reagan and Singer in that particular book. So those are the kind of book references. This is Between the Species, and the relevant part of that is, I'll just bring it up, which is, let me see if I can make the screen a bit bigger, perhaps. Reflections on Tom Reagan and the Animal Rights Movement That Once Was, by Gary Francione. And so this is a special not long after Reagan died, and it was called Tom Reagan in Memorandum, and it was basically a set of essays reflecting on Reagan's work or his life as well. So that was pretty interesting. In terms of podcast resources, I'm using this one, and this is the Gary Francione and Anna Charlton interview on Go Vegan Radio with Bob Linden. And so this is my blog. And so I've reproduced it. You can see that it's 2017 is reproduced, but there's a media player embedded into there, as you can see. And so this is where, not long again after Reagan died, Francione and Anna Charlton, who both knew him, talked about his life. So that was quite interesting. Getting towards the end of just the resources here, folks. So Knowing Animals, number 160. So this is Robert Garner's appearance on the show. And he's talking about a new book that he had about the Oxford Group. And then we have the History of Animal Rights Movement by Norm Phelps. We'll probably be showing a couple of video clips from him, maybe in part 3 of this little series. So so that's to be looked forward to, as it were. And then just a little note for myself, really, in a sense, that I had the privilege of featuring in a Knowing Animals episode, number 39 there. And sadly, Siobhan O'Sullivan, pictured here, the presenter, died last year. Last month, in fact, about a month ago, age 49, from ovarian cancer. So she's sadly missed. And I think I posted on my Facebook page today a kind of obituary to her in that sense. And then finally, for now at least, this is Alex Hershaft on the David Rams show, on the Rams Den. Okay, so that's why is Singer so idolized by folks who should know better? It depends who you talk to, Deb, actually, because academics tend to situate Singer correctly, but the movement doesn't. Groups like PETA never have, and they've kind of got an ideological reason for not. So we're actually going to come on to that, which is quite interesting. But academics, of all the people, even though they do make mistakes, and we're going to see a couple of them actually in the next few minutes, they are the least ones likely to kind of situate Singer wrongly as an animal rights person. But they all often trot out this thing about Peter Singer started the animal rights movement and stuff, and then they go on to say, well, of course, Singer's position is not animal rights. So it's always a bit confusing. And I think that for people who don't take that much of an interest in those kind of issues, it gets to such an extent that people just stop kind of listening to the nuances of it. I think that's what it is. But anyway, we'll come on to that. So Norm Phelps then, which I mentioned above, and as I said, film clips coming up in the series. He breaks ranks with most historians, actually, because he denies that the animal rights movement came out of the animal welfare movement. That's a common phrase, that there was first the animal welfare movement and then animal rights kind of emerged from it. He suggests rather that it came out of the human rights movement, which was based on Enlightenment thinking. So that's an interesting kind of difference from most. He dates back the beginning of our movement, not to Singer, but to this, which is the October the 10th, 1965 piece by Bridget Brophy. Now, one interesting thing here is you'll see that this is something from YouTube. So this is Andy, who has narrated this particular essay or article, just as he's narrated lots and lots of movement history things of late. And so if you want to actually listen to it being read out, then this is the place to go. So you can see there, not your mum, not your milk. That's the website. There is 2 or 3 with a similar name. So I think Andy has put his name in brackets afterwards. So that's where you look out to. So this particular article, which people like Richard Ryder credit for being the start of the movement rather than Singer, this particular article led to the formation of the Oxford Group, which included Singer. And that led to the 1971 publication of Animals, Men and Morals, which didn't include Singer because he was kind of late to the group, if you like. And so they were a kind of group of people around Oxford University who took interest in animal ethics. And it was when Singer met them, he noticed that they weren't eating other animals, and he wanted to know why. And when they told him, he set out to prove them wrong, and then found that he couldn't. So that's where Singer first became a vegetarian. I say first became a vegetarian because he's still not a vegan anyway. Okay, Phelps says that 1979. Sorry, I've got to start that again. 1975 marks the most important year to this very day in the history of the animal movement. And he said that there's three reasons for that. One, because it's the publication date for Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, and that led to the movement. The Brophy article didn't have that effect, whereas the Animal Liberation is said to have had that effect. Then we've got Henry Spearer. We're going to come back to him towards the end of this part one. And also the Conference of the Vegetarian Union, which took place in that year. And Herschaft, in his interview with Rams, said that was very important as well. And then a little later, we've got up to 1980, and we've got, inspired by Peter Singer, we have the birth of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Gary Francione was working for them as legal advisor at the time. He saw them as fairly kind of rights-based at the time, and then things went fairly sour fairly quick. So he says that really the 1980s and onwards was the dawn of animal rights through the publication of Reagan, but it is also the start of what he calls the animal confusion movement. So that's where he comes from. Finson and Finson, in this red book here, they go further back, and they do tie animal rights and animal welfare together, like most historians do. And they say whether we're talking about the United States or Britain, then animal welfare was the thing out of which, as it were, animal rights emerged. But they also say that placing the start of the modern animal rights movement is extremely tricky. They do note that most people will say that animal liberation is the start of it, but more and more historians are now citing Bridget Brophy instead. Right, so I want to read you a couple of things. I've got a couple of things from the Jasper and Nelkin book. You can see that there. Okay, so I just want to read a couple of things, and I've got some things for on the screen as well. This is a chapter 7, and it's called "Philosophers had Midwives for a Movement." And so they say almost every animal rights activist either owns or has read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, which, since its publication in 1975, has become a Bible for the movement. Singer is an Australian philosopher committed to the analysis of moral disputes. And in the preface of his 1971 Oxford thesis, in other words, his PhD, which was then published in a book called Democracy and Disobedience, Singer urged philosophers to leave their abstract word games and take stances on moral issues. So that was quite an interesting one. In particular, he says this: if philosophers are to say anything of importance about major issues, they must go beyond the neutral analysis of words and concepts, which was, until recently, characteristic of contemporary philosophy in Britain and North America. Moral and political philosophers must be prepared to give their opinions with supporting arguments on the rights and wrongs of complex disputes. So Nelkin and Jasper say this argument was a call to arms for his profession. heavily dominated at the time by an analytic tradition, more concerned with clever language analysis than moral issues. So there's always been this divide within philosophy. You know, the analytical side of things, they will talk for hours about, you know, concepts and ideas and trolley problems and everything else, but they don't necessarily see it as being connected to the real world or to their own lives, that kind of thing. Singer is saying that they should, and Reagan joins him in that plea, if you like. They also go, Singer grounded his arguments about the treatment of animals in a utilitarian perspective. For utilitarians, ethical decisions should be made by adding up all pleasures and pains that would result from different choices. And then they go on to quote people like Bentham. But they do say this, which is also true. And going back to what Deb was saying before, this is where some academics will situate Singer, as it were, correctly. Singer's utilitarian approach allows animal experimentation if suffering is minimized and the research has a high probability of yielding aggregate benefits that outweigh the individual pain. Nor does Singer unequivocally reject all animal products. It is permissible to eat free-range eggs, for these hens can live comfortably. They do not appear to mind the removal of their eggs. So that's a quote from Singer. So this has been Singer's position from 1975, and so, you know, a lot of stuff about, well, he's a vegan advocate, he started the animal rights movement, he's always problematic in terms of his own philosophy, and in his defense, in a way, and Andy and I did a program about this. He's always been truthful about his position. He's never claimed to be an animal rights advocate. In fact, he's denied being an animal rights advocate for many, many years. There's a particularly strong response to a review of animal liberation in which he kind of berates the reviewer by going, why are you coming at me about rights? You know, animal liberation got nothing to do with rights. And he said, I even regret using the word in the book now, kind of thing. You know, I shouldn't have used the damn word even, kind of thing. So he's always had that position. While many pragmatists in the movement accept Singer's philosophy, most fundamentalists reject his utilitarian position, allowing the use of animals if anticipated benefits exceed the cost of suffering. While fundamentalists use his book in recruiting members, they find it too moderate. And now this is really interesting because Jasper and Nelkin are sociologists, so they interviewed quite a lot of animal advocates, and so this is the view of one of their respondents, which is really interesting. Singer is not an animal person, many say. He has no particular fascination, interest, or love for animals, and no companion animals. One activist, herself living with 8 cats, complained, he is very highly evolved intellectually, but there's no emotion, no feeling. Is cerebral, not an animal lover. So there's a lot of renewed talk in the movement about loving animals, as we know. And so this is an interesting one, that, you know, animal rights people are really animal lovers. So that's a controversial thing. You'd think he could at least take an animal or two from the pound. The growing crusade for animals soon outpaced Singer's position. Now, this is where Jasper and Nelkin kind of get it half right and half wrong. As protesters developed an uncompromising stand against any use of other animals for human ends, Tom Reagan emerged as the philosopher articulating the rights perspective of these fundamentalists. So then it talks about how Reagan started writing at the same time as Singer did, and he had this essay called The Moral Basis of Vegetarianism. In a position more extreme than Singer's, Reagan argues that animals have inherent worth as living creatures and should never be used as resources. Reagan came to this view gradually, so this is quite an interesting part. In a 1982 essay, he admitted animals could be used in some experimental research. However, only a year later, he published his central treatise, The Case for Animal Rights, developing a more absolutist position that broke from utilitarianism. His view reflected the emerging sentiment of an increasing number of animal activists. The philosophies of fundamentalists and pragmatists in the animal crusade began to emerge. So they're saying that we essentially then start seeing the argument about animal rights and animal welfare kind of emerging because of these big kind of themes between utilitarianism and Reagan's view about the ontology, for example. Now, I'm not going to read all this. I just want to point out the fact that Singer says this. Reagan says, "I cannot begin to count the number of times I have sat through discussions or read essays in which my views regarding the rights of animals were attributed not to me but to Singer." So that has been part of the problem, that some of Reagan's ideas have been attributed to Singer. And then Jasper and Nelkin say this, and this is where they get it right and they get it wrong. But despite the confusion, it is Reagan's rights argument, not Singer's utilitarianism, that has come to dominate the rhetoric of the animal rights agenda, often pushing it beyond reformism and pragmatism. So the reason that's right and wrong at the same time is this bit about Reagan's rhetoric did dominate the movement, and so the movement calls itself the animal rights movement, and we use words like animal rights all the time. But that's not to say that his philosophy dominates the movement. That remains in Singer's hands. And so this last bit here is fascinating sentence, because it's kind of right and wrong all at the same time, which is quite interesting. Right, so while most movement histories mention the distinctions between animal rights or the animal rights movement and the humane movement, the Finsons say that the connections between the two should not be neglected. They also trace a common path to animal rights via the likes of these chappies. So Pythagoras, Plutarch, and Porphyry. I suppose we could say spot the difference. We have a little competition, spot the difference between the two. And they mention the famous 1780 footnote by Jeremy Bentham. Now, this is really interesting within our movement, because this is featured time and time again over many years in our movement, and yet it was merely a footnote, which is quite interesting. And most people know that end bit, which is picked out in bold, but the rest of it is quite interesting. So if you're watching the recording, you could pause this now and read that, because it's quite an interesting section, even though it's only that last bit that usually people remember. So they concur with Phelps, saying that human rights were already in the air, so to speak, to guide the development of animal ethics. And they mention people like Henry Salt, and we've got a time tunnel about him, Peter Singer, and Richard Ryder, who are there on the screen. They write that sexism and racism is cut from the same cloth that speciesism is, which is something that these people have said, or at least the latter two, and also Reagan said that. And they conclude that we should not be surprised to find those who fight to end racism and sexism also oppose speciesism, which, of course, is a controversial thing to say, and it's something that animals-only vegans would not accept. They talk about what they call the displacement thesis, which is also called the extension thesis. There's kind of two types of this, and it's the second type which is most relevant to animal advocates. It gets a little bit complicated, but let's hope we can make some head here. The first revolves around the misanthropic animal lover who cares more about other animals than humans. They find that the second extension is truer. They say that although displacement would suggest that concern for other animals displaces concern for humans, it's actually the opposite that seems to be true. Most animal advocates have traditionally cared about everyone, in other words. And you can even see that in titles of some books that I haven't cited today. But for example, you've got The Extended Circle, Animal Rights, Extending the Circle of Compassion, and also The Expanding Circle. These are all titles of books in the movement. There has always been accounts, they say, for the concern for children, the poor, and other animals in all of these histories. Francis Power Cobb and William Wilberforce are often cited. The Finsons say that the US movement follows the same pattern, concern for other animals and humans, and that their account of the rise and fall of the anti-vivisection movement is fairly kind of fascinating. They mention the historical significance in Britain of the brown dog affair and the working class involvement in that. And there is a time tunnel about the brown dog affair if you want to check that out. And in terms of joining the dots, it turns out that in the 1860s, so-called common prostitutes were often detained and forced to undergo invasive gynecological examinations. And working class women began to complain about their treatment by the medical profession. For example, being strapped down for some procedures, and if they were poor people, just like the other animals, operated upon with no anesthesia. Even though anesthesia had become widely used then, it was refused to them because they were poor and couldn't pay, presumably, or, on some basis like that. There was even a treatment for women involving surgery on their nose bones to prevent to cure them from masturbating. And so the Finsons say, in short, both women and the working poor saw their own oppression in the torture of other animals under the vivisector's knife. And so again, this is kind of like connecting the dots, which is a very kind of interesting history and certainly reflected by the brown dog issue, as I've said. The history of the US animal movement is presented as modeled closely on developments in Britain. Anti-cruelty societies first, for example, and then anti-cruelty legislation on a single issue basis. And then we get in 1883, we got Carolyn Earl White, who began the American Anti-Vivisection Society. Now, this is fascinating in itself. She was prevented, for serving as one of the officers of this society, even though she began it, because she was a woman, so she wasn't allowed. And another interesting kind of parallel with British events is that Earl White began as a reformist, but then having experienced and seen the attempts at legislation, all the blockages and all that kind of stuff, she became an abolitionist. So moving on somewhat, and this book I didn't mention until now, this is Richard Ryder and Animal Revolution, Changing Attitudes Towards Speciesism. Don't forget that Ryder was the person who coined the word speciesism. It was published in 1989. He says that the small matter of the world wars did no favors for social movements anywhere on the planet, as it were. Rather, in an understated way, Ryder says that the wars were disruptive, which I think you can probably agree with. And in fact, we've seen in this series of time tunnels how the Second World War was instrumental in starting the vegan peace movement, and then instrumental in the development and evolution of vegan philosophy as well. Going back to the States, the Finsons say that in turn, it was the Vietnam War that was important in North America and in terms of the North American movement. And the timeline for the Vietnam War It's probably longer than people remember. It's 1954 through to 1975, and I think most people see it as a kind of 1970s kind of thing. So according to the Finsons then, it was not until the end of the Vietnam War that the animal rights movement really moved to the United States. So that's an interesting phrase, moved to, as it were, being transferred from Britain. There's quite a lot of people who moved as well a little later. For example, Kim Stallwood, who became vegan in 1976, started his work for other animals with compassionate animal farming, then moved on to the BYV, and then went over to the States to work for PETA, and then became the editor of something called Animals Agenda. They do note one 1960 development as very significant, and this is the 1967 foundation by Cleveland Amory of the Fund for Animals. And if you look at the time tunnel about the history or the early history of Sea Shepherd, not the Orkney one, but the early history of Sea Shepherd when they emerged from Greenpeace International, you can see the importance of the Fund for Animals. Alex Hershaft on Cleveland Amory, he actually calls him the father and even the grandfather of the animal rights movement. And I think you'll see that in those film clips that I keep promising you, but you're not going to get to today. Up to the 1970s, which is the crucial decade, according to most historians of our movement. The Finson says that animal liberation was highly influential, and not least because Singer couples his utilitarian philosophy with graphic depiction of the treatment of other animals. And so that's one thing that marked Singer very differently from Reagan. And you could see then, in terms of being a tool for a social movement, Singer was much more useful than Reagan was. Reagan was just talking, philosophically about other animals, whereas Singer was often describing what we did to them in factory farms, for example, and et cetera, as well. So this brings us near to the end and brings us back to Henry Spearer, that I mentioned before, described as an American activist for socialism and for human and other animal rights. He was a journalist for something called The Militant. He was the first journalist to travel to Cuba to interview Castro after the revolution. And he also wrote, on trade union issues. He formed Animal Rights International in 1974. And he's best known for a 1976 campaign against vivisection on cats at the American Museum of Natural History. Let's go back to 74. He'd done a course with Peter Singer. So Peter Singer had gone over there and he effectively taught animal liberation as a university module. And so Spearer attends that course, in which Singer is bound to have said that he wasn't an animal rights person, that he was a utilitarian and actually rejects rights theory. And yet the group that was formed on the basis of that was called Animal Rights International. So again, the animal confusion movement. He had been conducting, the Museum of Natural History had been conducting vivisection on cats for 20 years, researching the impact of certain types of mutilization on the sex lives of other animals. There's loads of that kind of stuff going on at the time. The museum altered the research in 1977 after a campaign. So Spearer really pushed for kind of single issue pressure campaigns. The Revlon campaign is really quite interesting. I remember that campaign featuring everywhere, really. If I can show you this just for a second. This is the Beast magazine. I know it gets a little bit psychedelic with all the things, but that's the Beast magazine. And it often featured in there. This came out in 79, 80 type of thing. The Beast magazine is interesting for me in the sense that I was working for Ford's Motors in Dagenham, Essex, famous kind of Ford plant at the time. And I was on the production line, and we got 12 seconds between cars, essentially. And so I read that book, that magazine, 12 seconds at a time. So Spira may well become a future time tunnel subject, I think, and also possibly the Silver Spring Monkey case, which effectively launched Peter in 1981 as a campaigning entity, putting them on the animal movement map, if you were, as you were. And so, oh, I've got to put this back on. There we go. This brings us to the last slide and up to the lead up to the March on Washington in 1990. And then that was followed by a second march in 1996, which was poorly attended. And so it's the history and the politics of that, which marks part 2 of this little kind of series. So that's going to be for next time. The eagle-eyed people of you will spot Tom Reagan and Gary Francione in the picture. In fact, I intended to start this little 3-part thing in 1990 with this march, but it didn't happen, and so I kind of had to go back a bit, and so this is going to be part 2. Andy said that Francione looks like a Spartan here. LOL. Going back to the forum that I was on, the early days of the internet, they used to put this LOL there all the time, and also this kind of Ralph thing. What is it? Rolling on the floor, laughing my ass off. That thing. They used to be doing that all the time. It used to irritate me really. And whenever they put LOL, I used to say, "I love you lots too," just to irritate them back. Yeah, there was a longer version of that. That's rolling on the floor laughing, but then there's something to do with arseholes as well. So so there is a longer version of this, and so that's going to be part 2. This has been part 1. I don't think we've missed any, unless I've missed any as I've been chuntering away. So Andy, if I've missed any, you can put them up right now if you want. But I don't think I have. Andy actually says here, I've enhanced video with Reagan and Cleveland in 2. So yeah, we've again, go to not Your Mum, Not Your Milk on YouTube. And the difference is it's Not Your Mum Not Your Milk for some reason. But again, you've got Andy A there to make sure you get the right one. Okay, people, so that's your time tunnel for this week. A kind of a rather interesting look at the beginnings of the movement in North America, which were, according to most historians, based on the experience in Britain, which was a little earlier, except for a couple of people who say that's not the case, but that's the way that most people see it. So I'll see you next week for part 2, folks. Bye for now. Earthlings and Earthlings. And look, I've done my intro wrong. So hello, Earthlings. How are you doing? This is Roger Yates and Ruja the cat, who wants to sit on my knee for the duration, I believe. So welcome to the time tunnel. So we're putting together an archive, as people know. I think we've got about 30 time tunnels together now. So we're in the middle of a little mini series within the time tunnel, which is about the North American movement. And so this one is quite dramatically called The Death of the Animal Rights Movement in North America. So I'll explain that as we go. And welcome to another time tunnel. Yes, indeed. So the death of the North American movement. The second of three shows, as I said. Last time we looked at how the North American animal rights movement developed over time and where the influences were for that development, etc. And so today, as you can see, is this death idea. This, in a sense, is very closely linked to next week. This is like the evidence for the prosecution that the movement over there is dead. I have as my main witnesses people like Gary Francione and Anna Charlton, with the aid now and again of Tom Reagan. So that's the score. Now, the interesting thing about next week is he's going to say that everything I say today is wrong. So that's the two sides of the argument, really. In terms of timeline, I'll be jumping back and forth from about 1989 to the present day. Now, as always, don't forget to comment. Feel free to comment. There will be no charge, obviously, for you having your comments displayed on the screen. Andy is working away in the background, monitoring, so we shouldn't miss anything. And as always, people, if you're not on my YouTube, that's the place to be for the best of the chat, because everybody will be able to see everybody else's comments. If you comment on Facebook, for example, we will be able to see your comment, but you won't be able to see anybody else's. So that's the limitation there. But feel free to join from everywhere, of course. Okay, so on with it then. As I said, 89 to about the present day. We start off really with what's been described as the death certificate of the movement. So this is from 2005. This is supposed to be the death certificate of the animal rights movement and the birth certificate of the humane exploitation movement, or the happy exploitation movement, as sometimes people call it. So it's really a kind of Dear John letter, really. It's signed by Peter Singer and representatives of various groups. And so this is about the fact that at this time, there was a big push to start getting involved with animal welfare standards. And Whole Foods, the company, really started to get involved with all of that. And this is the groups congratulating them for doing so. And so this is why it's seen as very problematic from an animal rights point of view. So those are the signatures. There'll be some names you don't know probably, and others that you do. Doris Day Animal League, Farm Sanctuary, HSUS, PETA, Mercy for Animals, Vegan Outreach, and Viva US. So we're talking about this movement, which became a collaboration between the animal rights movement and the animal user industries to develop over time these new welfare use regimes, really. This here is a report that the process began in 2003 by Whole Foods to set out these animal welfare standards, and they wanted to do it species by species. So they had a whole set of meetings, species by species, to work out how best to exploit them. We might expect this collaboration between the industry to be the industry and animal welfare groups, and be restricted to animal welfare groups. And so this is one aspect which is rather surprising and upsetting for an abolitionist point of view, because of the number of groups that would regard themselves as animal rights groups getting involved with this user industry regime, how to use them better, etc. So it hasn't been the case. So as I said then, the 2005 letter was signed by Peter Singer and all those other signatories. I do have a little audio from John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, to explain the situation better for us in his own words, as it were.
It's a multi-stakeholder process, and the way it works is we brought in all these activist groups that you see down here, AWI, Viva USA, PETA, HSUS, ARI, and Farm Sanctuary have all participated. And if there's some other group here that's participated that I just left out, sorry. We also have the producers come in, and there's a species at a time, and it's and then we have Whole Foods people that are there. We have animal experts, and they're all animal experts who care deeply about animals, and PETA and Viva make sure that there are vegan type veterinarians that are there, that so that there's our animal expert scientists, so that will be a wide representation of science experts there.
Okay, so 12 years into this process, this is 2015 now, Gary Francione writes what he calls an open request to several of the groups involved. Really, it's a set of complaints rather than an open request, really. He says that they all claim to reject what he calls happy exploitation, but at the same time, they're all helping set its standards. And Francione complains that these collaborations lead to appalling results from an animal rights point of view. He frequently mentions PETA's endorsement, for example, of Bell and Evans organic chicken flesh, which has been featured on their website ever since, I believe. I think Gary Francione claims that it was on the front page of their website for a long time, but it's still there now, as you can see here. I don't know if you can pick it out. It's that kind of middle paragraph there, where Ingrid Newkirk is saying that Bell and Evans show that animal welfare and good business can go hand in hand, and this idea of listening to the consumers. The bottom part there is an award to Bell and Evans from Whole Foods, again about their wonderful kind of welfare ideas. And so this is kind of the product of this process that has been going on for quite a while, but being led by the North American movement. Now, in terms of the open request, Francione received a lot of pushback from it, and not least from Tony Wardle of Viva. So this is the complaint was that you can't expect abolition, and that you've not even been able to make your own university vegan. So how do you expect to make the world vegan? That actually became a major kind of claim against Francione for a good long time. So there's quite a lot of vitriol here. It led to them both having a debate at London Veg Fest of 2015. Later that year, they had a kind of debate about their entire kind of process. So these also are some of the things that are going on within this particular stance that is been developing since about 2003. An attack on vegan purity became very, very common. And so the first one is Bruce Friedrich, once of PETA, and then at Farm Sanctuary. And now Beyond Meat, I believe, one of those companies is involved. And again, you've got this thing about some people won't go vegan because they can't give up cheese and ice cream. So therefore, it was quite common for ideas like vegan until 6 and be vegan except for cheese, and these kind of ideas started to come in. The middle one is Peter Singer, and again, it's kind of based on the restaurant kind of idea. Don't send something back if they've mistakenly put dairy cheese on it, for example, and this kind of thing. And the bottom one is from PETA, from the PETA website. And again, it's not about purity. And so this kind of "don't be fussy in restaurants" theme became a real kind of big deal and kind of part of what was being argued. And it was a big thing going on in Europe at the time as well, led by people like Tobias Leonhardt. So here's a video example from the Leonhardt stable, along with the construction of the vegan and the purist vegan. So that's what's been said here.
Veganism, you want to be like a really pure vegan. You learn all about, we're vegan, what's not vegan, I mean, of course, eggs and dairy is, it's quite obvious. And then you go to honey and then you do little ingredients and everything. And if you look at the curve, for example, like, if again, we look at the impact our own diet has, being an omnivore is not a lot of impact. And then if you're being a flexitarian, that's, you're already starting, to save some animals. If you're being vegetarian, you're even better. And then if you're vegan, you have more impact. And the effort, of course, also grows. But actually, if you're purist vegan, in some ways, it's actually, I mean, there's way more effort you have to put into in becoming like a pure vegan. If you really like every tiny ingredients, for each, even if you order like a salad in a restaurant, you ask, well, but the vinegar in the salad, how has this been clarified? Because otherwise I don't want to eat the salad. So I made the experience, it's actually, you're generating way more effort. So, but actually the impact actually goes down because, first of all, I mean, it's a lot of time you're spending, and people around you, if they actually see you, if you really make it look complicated being a vegan, you actually, giving you're sending a bad message. I mean, maybe you think that maybe there are some people who are mighty. Oh my God, he's like, she's like holy, like a Jain, who actually walks and wipes the floor. But I mean, Jainism, I mean, it's good to have some of those people around, but it's not probably not going to become like a very popular religion.
Okay, so for people who might not know who that is Melanie Joy's husband, Sebastian. He took her name, Sebastian Joy. At the time, he was running the German Vegetarian Society, which endorsed egg products, and which actually ended up, there was a demonstration on stage this year, I think. This is about 2016, perhaps, that video. Leonhardt at the same time ran the Belgium Vegetarian Society, and he advised people who were talking to politicians not to mention the dread vegan word. And these two people are responsible for the construction of a very ableist, crazy vegan stereotype. You'll probably notice that they were speaking at Luxembourg, and they're at Luxembourg again this year. So it's interesting, really, because the Animal Rights Conference, the International Animal Rights Conference, it's called, in Luxembourg, used to be the place where you had a lot of direct action groups. This is where Steve Best delivered his total liberation speech. And ever since then, from about 2014 onwards, in line with this move, it's been Melanie Joy, Leonhardt, and Sebastian Joy giving talks, and usually about vegan purity and this kind of stuff. When Leonhardt came to Dublin sometime later, an autistic activist asked him to apologize for the ableist stereotype, but he refused. So these are the kind of relevant developments in the movement, which begs the question, so what happened to the North American animal rights movement? And the short answer to that is it was killed. So Gary Francione addresses this issue in a long piece he wrote for Between the Species. It was an article on Tom Reagan the year after Tom died. And both he and Anna Charlton, along with Bob Linden from Go Vegan Radio, spoke about it on their show. And so we're going to drop back a little bit to kind of come back forward to kind of trace what is said to happen from this perspective, as it were, of the prosecution, as I said. Okay, so Gary Francione posed this question. He said, would it be any different if Tom and I had stayed working together? The truth is, I do not know. And it's interesting this because they were developing a really close working relationship, which a lot of people kind of didn't know about, although it was pretty well developed, actually going on tour together and this kind of stuff. People like Singer refused to do that. Francione says, on the other hand, there is no doubt that Tom and I had succeeded in building the foundation of a rights movement. We got close to seeing that movement emerge. And in fact, the article is called the movement that used to be. And so they're really saying that they got close to creating a real rights-based animal rights movement, but it didn't quite happen. And kind of this is why. In May 1984, there was a break-in at a laboratory at the Pennsylvania Medical School. And there is a time tunnel about that, about the unnecessary fuss video that eventually was released. So that's pretty interesting. Francione said that he decided on the back of that to organize a rally at the university in the following April. So that's 1985 at this stage, to protest the experiments. Now, the interesting thing about this is the university is Francione's university, where he was working, where he was teaching at the time. So that's why he was very involved with the organization of it. And also it was quite a controversial thing for a professor to start doing, organizing a protest against your own university, this kind of stuff. He said it seemed to make sense to have the author of the Case for Animal Rights speak at the rally that they had planned. But one fear was that Reagan would turn them down. And Francione says, given the difficulty of getting academics to criticize academic institutions, particularly in this sort of situation, so he thought there's a good chance that it was just going to be too controversial for Reagan to actually take part. And so in early '85, Gary Francione talks to Tom Reagan for the very first time. Reagan already knew about what was going on in Pennsylvania and accepted the invitation to go to Philadelphia for the rally. And that was scheduled for April of 1985. He says this, he said, I recall Tom remarking that I was probably having an uncomfortable time at the university. I assured him that there was no probability about it. Penn was indeed furious with me. And so that's the kind of situation that they found themselves in as academics and also advocates, this kind of scholar activist kind of problem that you can get sometimes. Tom stayed with Gary Francione the night before the rally took place, and they all stayed up for much of the night, talking about a common desire they had to see a real animal rights movement emerge in the United States. And they said, they talked and they said, well, there is some early signs of such a movement. They said, for example, the case involving the Silver Spring monkeys that had brought PETA to prominence in the movement was one. And also there'd been some rallies organized under the name of Mobilization for Animals. And that kind of gave them some indication that, the time was ripe for a genuine kind of rights-based movement, if you like. Francione says that Tom Reagan agreed to speak at the Penn rally because he recognized that it was a milestone. Never before had there been such a challenge to federally funded research at a prestigious university. So in some senses, this was kind of groundbreaking stuff going on. The events organizers who had planned the rally, including Francione and a few others, didn't have much experience of organizing such an event. So they didn't really know if people, many people would attend. In fact, Francione was actually frightened that nobody would turn up because they'd never done it before, and it was kind of new. So officially, he was hoping for about 100 people, but he feared the worst, as it were. He said that Tom Reagan was always more optimistic and told Francione not to worry, saying that he had a good feeling about the entire event. And it turned out well in the end. Francione says, when we turned the corner to enter the rally area, I was flabbergasted to see at least 1,500 people gathered. I looked at Tom and said, we are seeing the beginning of an animal rights movement. And so Francione says that the rally was a great success. Interestingly, Francione had a second worry about Tom Reagan. First, whether he'd go in the first place, and the second being, well, what would he be like giving a speech at a rally? He said that when they were talking the previous night, he says Tom came over as a mild-mannered person and very academic. And he said that, frankly, he was worried that Reagan was going to get onto the podium and start talking about Immanuel Kant's view on inherent value and put everybody to sleep. So that was very wrong. When Tom got to the microphone, the academic Reagan vanished. Tom became a powerful visionary who spoke with passion and conviction. He was, as they say, on fire. And of course, if anybody sees the sort of justice talk, which is still regarded by many people as the best animal rights speech ever, you'll see what Francione means. That was about this time. I don't think it's exactly the same issue, but it's about this time. Francione said that the crowd responded to Reagan with great enthusiasm, and that they had a sense that something very important had happened that day. And so the next question was, okay, so what do we do next? So a few things led eventually to the 1990 rally, which I want to talk about. First of all, in the summer of '85, there was a sit-in at the National Institute of Health. And again, that's all mentioned in the time tunnel about the unnecessary fuss video. The unnecessary fuss video is still, as far as I can see, probably the most powerful anti-vivisection movie of video ever made. And the reason for that is it was made by the vivisectors themselves. And so it was never meant to be seen by anyone apart from themselves. So on that sense, there's nothing staged. They're not trying to hide anything. It's kind of pretty devastating on that. Also in 1985, again, kind of buoyed up by what was going on, the Culture and Animals Foundation was founded by Tom and Nancy. They launched it in '85. And Francione became an advisor to the foundation. And then we have the 1988 Sword of Justice speech that I mentioned before. So this is a little bit later. And that brings us then to the famous march. It was called the March for Animals in Washington, D.C., which included a weekend of activist workshops and also things like street theater performances and all that. The issue about the numbers attending is quite interesting here. You'll see Reagan is stood to the right there of the banner saying June the 10th, and next to him is Francione and one of the plant-based doctors behind. I can never remember the poor guy's name, so if anybody knows who that is, Clapper, I think it's Clapper. Okay, so the numbers are interesting in this. The police estimated that there was 24,000 people. Francione himself reckons that it was double that number. Reagan put the number at 60,000, and the highest estimates by some people who attended were in the 90,000 mark. Now, Norm Phelps, and we'll meet him next week when he's saying that all of this is wrong, agreed with the lower police estimate. Sociologists Jasper and Nelkin, who I mentioned last week, they go for 30,000 people and say there was a strong anti-business feeling amongst the crowd. Many of the demonstrators wore paper badges bearing the slogan, "I am an animal rights terrorist." And this is because the Republican Secretary of Health and Human Services, Louis Sullivan, had called the entire animal rights movement terrorists a couple of days before the march. And so they came up with these impromptu badges, "I am an animal rights terrorist." The Finsons state that the march was 3 miles from the White House to the Capitol. They say the first marchers had reached their destination before many have even begun at the other end. So the numbers were fairly big. Francione said it was not a rights event exclusively, in that it included many welfarists, such as Peter Singer, he says. However, he said that the march had a strong rights orientation, and this is what they deliberately tried to construct. He said, for one thing, Tom Reagan was the co-chair and organizer of the events, and so animal rights rhetoric dominated all the speeches. Now, the use of the term rhetoric here is quite interesting because, you know, you probably get a lot of animal rights rhetoric in speeches ever since. It's a question of if there's an adherence to the philosophy kind of behind it, which is quite interesting. So that's interesting. A declaration of the rights of animals, which had an abolitionist message, was presented to the rally. and Francione says that many of the speakers explicitly disavowed welfarism and supported abolitionist messages. However, not all did that. For example, actor and horse rider Christopher Reeve didn't. I suppose he was the Joaquin Phoenix of his time, I suppose. He had already begun an interest in buying, riding, and competing on horses. He urged moderation rather than confrontation. He said that social movements didn't get anywhere from the fringe, whereas there are some people like Patrice Jones which are saying that if the fringe all get together, then that's the way to do it. Anyway, he was booed off stage, Christopher Reeve. So all's well that ends well. Also in 1990, Gary Francione and Anna Chapman co-founded the Rutgers Animal Rights Law Center, which became an interesting place for people to get advice on things like dissection and everything, but also it ended up talking about issues, you know, animal rights and abortion, animal rights and left-wing politics, and this kind of stuff. It's quite interesting. Yes, Rouge, my cat is complaining at the moment, but we shall continue. Right, so by the time we get to 1992, Animals Agenda published a point-counterpoint article. So Tom Reagan and Gary Francione wrote an essay entitled "A Movement's Means Creates Its Ends." It was about the tactics that would reflect and then implement the philosophical theory of animal rights, essentially. Francione says it proposed the rejection of welfare campaigns and single-issue campaigns that substituted one form of exploitation for another. So the idea that, you know, if one thing gets closed down, then they'll switch species. You know, those kind of ideas that we've talked about, and I've talked about with Ronnie in the Still Alive program. He said that the article promoted veganism and the recognition of the relationship between human rights and animal rights. Ingrid Newkirk of PETA provided the counterpoint. She defended welfarism. In fact, she said that she was going into bat for the welfarists, she said. And Francione suggests that she characterized his and Reagan's position as purist. So again, this purist construction was used, this kind of idea. Her counterpoint essay was entitled, "Like a total victory, like checkmate, cannot be achieved in one move." By the 1990s, debates amongst animal advocates seemed to become more and more polarized, and that was seen. We ended up getting this idea of there are pragmatists and there are abolitionists, and those are, you know, the people who are having these kind of tactical and philosophical debates. One aspect of that was the characterization of abolitionists standing for all or nothing. This claim that people like Tom Reagan wanted all or nothing became repeated over and over and over again. And of course, you know, from an abolitionist point of view, it's quite insulting. Also, I mean, I've never known anybody take that line myself. Okay, so in 1993 and 1994, the Rutgers Animal Rights Law Center and the Culture and Animals Foundation. So, in other words, Francione's thing and Reagan's thing, they co-sponsored 2 conferences on animal rights and human rights, which is the course that Gary Francione and Alan Charlton still teach at Rutgers University. So that started in the 90s. Cesar Chavez was due to speak. He's of the American Farm Workers Union, but sadly died just before it took place. So he wasn't able to. Would they apply the purist criticism to other moral wrongs? I doubt it. Well, I don't know. It's kind of really. I think the interesting thing about that is that Reagan took this idea on. Didn't use purist, but he used the idea of extremist, and because they were getting called extremists, and he said, "But I am an extremist. If you mean I'm against moral wrongs all the time." And so this is where fanatical comes from, and purist, extremist. It means people who are morally consistent. When people call you a purist, they're complaining that you're morally consistent. So this is kind of like a really kind of weird kind of part of it. But moral consistency is actually seen negatively quite often because it's said to lead to fanaticism and stuff. Whereas obviously, just on a common sense level, being morally consistent is a very, very good thing to be, right? And so it's an interesting kind of argument. Francione suggests that these conferences marked the first time, at least in the United States, that animal rights advocates got together with advocates from other social justice movements. I probably doubt that is accurate, but it's his recollection, obviously. Tom Reagan and Gary Francione did lecture tours together. Sometimes they did joint presentations together. And he says that I do not recall a single speaking event which Tom and I were involved where we did not discuss the importance of human rights to the animal rights movement. And of course, Reagan had already written in the case that the animal rights movement is a part of and not opposed to the human rights movement. Okay, so we're getting near the end now, folks. In the late summer of 1995, Tom Reagan, Nancy Reagan, Anna Charlton, and Gary Francione, and a few others became involved in a grassroots network group. It was set up to develop and strengthen local groups, which is still something that is needed. And it is something that some of the British groups in the 1980s, like the BUAV, tried to do. They ended up having kind of like local campaign officers. But there's a kind of problem with that, which we'll come on to in a little minute. Both Reagan and Francione seemed confident that they were very close to seeing what they regarded as the emergence of a real animal rights movement. But of course, they faced a massive backlash from the established groups. Francione said the problem is that others understood what we were doing and they did not like the possibility nearly as much as we did. The large established corporate charities were welfare organizations. Most of their members did not know what a vegan was, let alone recognize an obligation to be one. The welfarists were, for the most part, people who liked dogs and cats and horses. They opposed hunting or possibly some aspects of vivisection. These groups were not interested in the radical rhetoric of the animal rights movement or the idea that advocates should only pursue abolitionist campaigns. So he says they were not happy about what he and Tom were doing. And he said, so that's really not kind of much of a surprise. They didn't think that the long established groups would really kind of go for this idea. But he says we were more shocked, really, more surprised by the fact that the newer, supposedly animal rights groups were also hostile to what we were doing. Although many of these groups thought of themselves as animal rights groups, they too were corporate charities and realized that it was much easier to do fundraising if they combined radical rhetoric with the traditional welfare and single issue campaigning. Campaigns which appealed to animal lovers who were not much interested in any sort of radical change, but they would support campaigns if it meant that they didn't have to change much in their own lives. So those became a big aspect in terms of, you know, where were the funds going? And of course, this is always a problem. If you've got a professional corporatized vegan movement, you've got the problem of funding it. And are there enough vegans to do so? And so this has always been a problem. He said that these were new welfare groups. And so he coined the phrase new welfare in Rain Without Thunder from 96. And he kind of accepted, at least in that book, kind of changed it a little bit in Animals as Persons. He kind of accepted that they were kind of eventual abolitionists. And it kind of amounted to the idea that welfare plus welfare plus welfare would equal animal rights. And he says that there's all kind of problems with those kind of ideas, both philosophically and practically. He says, so these were new welfare groups. They talked about animal rights, but they pursued a conventional animal welfare agenda as a supposed means to an abolitionist end. The new welfarist groups, just like the old welfarist ones, discouraged grassroots efforts. They wanted members who did two things: donated and provided free labor to get others to donate. And so that, I would suggest, is still kind of a problem. I think a lot of national groups, wherever they are, they try to get their members to do this. This is why they'll give you free leaflets, for example, because that means that you're free labor for them, and you're giving out their materials. But they're the ones who get the legacies. They're the ones who get the members. They're the ones who get the donations. He says that Tom and I were optimistic that we could persuade at least some of these new welfare groups to move in the rights direction. But it turned out that the movement, all of it, was just a business, he says, that saw what Tom and I were offering as a competing product. He puts it that way, that we were offering, that abolitionism was seen as a competing product in some kind of marketplace. And he said, and they just did not like it. Now, that's where I'm going to end, apart from saying that for the rest of this story, we could see that, you know, you can see that by actually looking at this article, which is online. So it's Between the Species, volume 21, as you say, there, 2018. And it's got a bunch of essays that leads off with the Francione one that I've gone through. And so essentially he tells the story about his eventual breakup with Tom Reagan because they went on separate lines, because there was a follow-up march in 1996 to the 1991. And he says that by this time it had been made official by the animal welfare movement. And so they virtually stripped all the rights components out of it. So they both decided to boycott it. Reagan wrote scathing essays about it, about what they were doing to a potential rights movement. And then he kind of goes on a bit of a holiday, or needs a break from the movement, and then he comes back and he'd completely changed his mind. And Francione was kind of perplexed by all this. And so Reagan said he doesn't agree with a lot of the march, but he'll go to it. You know, where have we heard that before? It's happening right now in Britain. So there was a big tension, and that created an issue between Francione and Reagan in the end, which led to them not working together. That leads back to that first question. Well, what would have happened if they had? You know, I always get the impression that they were a good team, and when they did work together, and you can see some evidence in terms of what they wrote and how they were influencing each other and everything, they were better when they were together. I think Francione kept Reagan on the vegan line stronger, and I think that Reagan kind of probably knocked a couple of the rough edges from Gary Francione, quite possibly. So I tend to think that is certainly the case. So if you want to as it were, see the rest of the case for the prosecution, it's in that, that article. And I checked today, it is online. You can get it free. You can download the PDF. So that's kind of not a problem. Now, have we missed anything, Andy, as we ran through that? I think I caught a couple of things. Jake, hello there. I would suggest what they did actually support a grassroots as long as they could fundraise. This is the national groups you're saying, is it? Well, yeah, there's that element as well. I mean, before the internet, I mean, I was involved lots and lots of times with this. You would go into a lab, you'd get documentation, you would give it to the national groups. You know, you would get some support from them because you were doing this kind of work for them. They would claim to the press that they just found it on their doorstep, you know, this kind of stuff. And so there was that symbiotic kind of thing there. So yeah, I think there is something in that sense. Whether that would completely contradict what Francione would claim as the overarching part of the relationship. Certainly, the free labor one is something that worries me. But there isn't really a place where people can go to get alternative materials. But there are some people working on that, but it's kind of not easy. And so this is, you know, if you need materials quick and you want it, you know, looking professional, multicolor and all that, where do you go? So it's a little bit kind of like that, I suppose. All right, people, if there's nothing else, I think we shall call this time tunnel to a close. Thank you for tuning in. We will be looking at the defense, which is basically saying that the animal rights movement is thriving. There's nothing wrong. It's certainly not dead. And there's not a problem incorporating welfarism into it. And that's going to be next week. So thanks for joining me for today. Hey, Earthlings, welcome along to the Vegan Time Tunnel. Now, this is a re-uploading of part 3 of the North American animal rights movement. It's not dead, it's alive. And reason for that is that there was a few technical problems with the first one, so I decided to do it again. And so here we are. So welcome along. Indeed, we're going to start off with Norm Phelps.
There is nothing in history that is absolutely new. Every idea, every movement has antecedents. The immediate antecedents of the modern animal rights movement were the human rights movements of the 1960s. Primarily civil rights and second wave feminism. Animal rights did not evolve from the earlier animal welfare movements. They grew out of the human rights movements that derived from the secular, rationalistic political philosophies of the Enlightenment. Animal rights is the orphan child of the 1960s. If I had to name a specific time and place for the birth of the American animal rights movement, I would give you October 10th, 1965, in London, England. On that date, Bridget Brophy, a British playwright, novelist, anti-war activist, and advocate for women's and gay and lesbian rights, published a full-page op-ed in the Sunday Times. Pointedly titled, "The Rights of Animals," Brophy's essay argued that animals, like human beings, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Toward the end of the 1960s, a small group made up mostly of postdoctoral students at Oxford University in England began getting together to discuss the ethical implications of our dominion over animals. In 1971, 3 members of this so-called Oxford group, Stanley and Rosalind Godlovich and John Harris, edited the first book produced by the modern animal rights movement, an anthology entitled Animals, Men, and Morals. 3 things happened in 1975 that made it the most remarkable year yet in the history of the American animal rights movement. First, Peter Singer published the book that would galvanize a generation into action. I know of almost no one who came to animal rights between 1975 and 2000 who does not describe reading Animal Liberation for the first time as something akin to a religious conversion. And that includes me. Second, a New York high school teacher began planning the first campaign of the modern American animal rights movement. The year before that, Henry Spira had taken a continuing education class on animal liberation that was being taught at City College in New York by Peter Singer. The third critical element of 1975 was the biennial conference of the International Vegetarian Union. The next milestone came in 1980, when Ingrid Newkirk and Alex Pacheco, inspired by Singer's Animal Liberation, founded a local animal rights group in Washington, D.C. that they called People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Overnight, PETA became a household word, and the process of establishing animal rights in the public consciousness that had been begun by Peter Singer and Henry Spira was substantially complete in the wake of the Silver Spring monkeys. From the mid-70s through the early 90s, animal rights groups and campaigns proliferated across the country as groups like Farm, United Poultry Concerns, and Farm Sanctuary gradually shifted the movement's primary focus from vivisection to animal agriculture. But by the middle of the 1990s, a deep anxiety had settled over the movement. After 20 years of high-octane advocacy, there was no measurable progress toward animal liberation. In fact, more animals were murdered in America in 1995 than had been in 1975. In 1990, a national march on Washington, patterned after Dr. Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, drew 24,000 participants to the National Mall. 6 years later, in 1996, a similar march drew fewer than 4,000. The drop-off in attendance reflected a growing belief that the environmental tactics we'd borrowed from the civil rights and feminist movements of the 60s, marches, demos, picketing, civil disobedience, and so forth, had failed us.
Yeah, so that was Norm Phelps. He's the author of this book here, The Longest Struggle, and also that video, which was called The History of the Animal Rights Movement. We're going to come back to a shorter clip of that in a while. We will remember that Norm Phelps breaks ranks with most historians of the movement, the people writing about the history of the movement, because he says that our movement did not develop out of the animal welfare movement, which a lot of people do say. And in fact, if that was true, it would be quite useful if it was true, if it did emerge, for example, as he suggests, out of the civil rights movement and second wave feminism, for example. We normally kind of date that about 1969. Then maybe our movement would be less drenched in animal welfare language. So that may have been quite a good idea. Phelps argues that the movement was substantially complete, as he puts it, once the combined forces of Peter and Peter, so that's People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals and Peter Singer, along with Henry Spearer, were added together. Together, he suggests that they established the notion of animal rights into the North American public consciousness. As I said then, his video is entitled The History of the Animal Rights Movement, and yet Tom Reagan is not mentioned. And for an animal rights advocate, and certainly a rights-based animal rights advocate, that's a very kind of odd thing, that you can have a history of our movement without mentioning the person who wrote the case for animal rights. Then we come to what he called the deep anxiety in the movement in the mid-1990s, following the success of the 1990 March on Washington. So this time tunnel then is about how the modern animal rights movement in North America emerged from this deep anxiety. And in that sense, we ask the question, what happened next? And just as a warning, the R word is used in this section of the film, so do take care if that's a problem for you.
And it was time for new strategies better suited to the world of the 1990s. This search produced two different answers, which in turn produced a movement divided into two wings. One wing, styling itself abolitionist, argued that the entire animal rights movement must pursue vegan advocacy and only vegan advocacy. We must all, according to this view, argue our pure moral position and nothing but our pure moral position. So-called single-issue campaigns and welfare reforms must be avoided, first because they are a betrayal of the moral baseline, veganism, and secondly, because they retard the cause of animal liberation by undermining the vegan abolitionist message. The other wing, which has never bothered to name itself, but was styled New Welfarists by the abolitionists, believed that in addition to vegan advocacy, the movement must seek out new ways to move a deeply recalcitrant public toward animal liberation. One partial, incremental step at a time. This group focused on initiatives to reduce the consumption of animal products, such as encouraging various forms of flexitarianism, and focused also on, welfare reform measures, such as bans on gestation crates for pigs and battery cages for laying hens, viewing these as valuable tools in the campaign for animal rights. And they saw a strategy of simply repeating the pure vegan message over and over as an exercise in futility. In 2004, Wayne Pacelle became president and CEO of the staid, conservative, old Humane Society of the United States, the biggest animal welfare, read dog and cat, organization in the world. In 2005, Pacelle merged HSUS with the more aggressive Fund for Animals, and shortly thereafter with the Doris Day Animal League, which was noted for its sophisticated lobbying machine. The result was a rejuvenated organization that was aggressive in pursuing initiatives for reducing the consumption of animal products and easing the suffering of animals on factory farms. With its large membership and budget, the new HSUS quickly became a major force in the moderate wing of the animal rights movement. Abolitionists, such as Rutgers law professor Gary Francione, filmmakers James Levesque and Jenny Stein, and others, responded to this development by arguing that HSUS and its allies were undermining the efforts of activists who were delivering a pure vegan message.
Okay, so in terms of these two wings of the movement, Phelps himself is on the moderate wing. He criticizes the abolitionist position as a one-track activism stance. He describes abolitionists as, quote, a vocal and sometimes intimidating clique that is trying to seize control of the animal rights movement, unquote. Instead of a one-track activism, the moderate wing of the movement turned to what they call two-track activism. And Phelps argues that campaigns to relieve the worst suffering of other animals on factory farms force the public to think of animals as sentient, sensitive beings whose well-being is a matter of serious moral concern. This can only advance, not, again, the R word, liberation. He also says, two-track activism works by first raising awareness and inspiring people to take an active stance against cruelty, and so that they see themselves as people who care about the suffering of other animals. This makes them more receptive to a vegan message. There are quite a few reducitarians in the movement who would suggest that that is actually still the way to go. In fact, there's some people who would say that we ought to temper our use of the word vegan because we're not quite in a kind of vegan-friendly place just yet. So in a quite an early time tunnel, I discussed the film, the Animals film. Now, this came out in 1981, and I've always described it as my generation's Earthlings. It was a groundbreaking documentary. I mentioned in that time tunnel that its director, Victor Schonfeld, appeared on the BBC World Service, it's a radio channel, on the 3rd and then the 10th of January in 2010. And he was fairly severely criticizing the animal rights movement because it had achieved so little in the 28 years since the film came out. Schonfeld followed that up on January 18th, 2010, in the Guardian newspaper, the Guardian based in London. The article was based on his radio features. We can see from the subtitle, from tacky nude posters to dubious concepts such as happy meat, animal rights groups are losing the fight for real change, that Schonfeld is taking a rather large swipe at people for the ethical treatment of animals. He said that he had so hoped to discover that the exploitation of animals for food and science had been reduced since the 1980s. What I found, however, was more than disappointing, a complete absence of decisive progress. So the following is what Victor Schonfeld regards as the animal movement's 5 fatal flaws, as he puts it. Number 1 is, instead of promoting animal rights goals as a major plank within broader social change movements, animal organizations insist on going it alone. Big critique from Schonfeld. Yet the Green Party's animal rights goals are as radical as any animal rights organizations. 2, one of the largest animal rights organizations routinely employ naked young women, including porn stars, to chase mass media attention. Would an animal rights organization stoop so low? 3, animal rights organizations have been handing out awards and lavishing praise on slaughterhouse designers and burger restaurant chains after negotiations for small changes that leave the system of exploitation intact. 4, instead of animal rights organizations promoting a clear moral baseline that individuals should become vegans to curb their own demands for animal exploitation, groups have given their stamp of approval to deeply compromised marketing concepts such as happy meat, freedom foods, sustainable meat, and conscientious omnivores. And finally, number 5, tactics of violence and personal intimidation have at long last fallen out of favor. But activists now pour energy and resources into organizations that lack any real strategy for bringing an end to animal exploitation, whether for food or for science. If that can be seen, and I think it can, as a severe critique of the moderate wing of the animal rights movement, it led to a response, and that came from PETA's Ingrid Newkirk, responding to Schoenfeld, again in The Guardian, and 3 days later. Newkirk really coolly dismantled his arguments in a powerful defense of what she would call a pragmatic blend of animal rights and animal welfare. So I've reproduced most of it here because this is a powerful defense of the animal rights movement in North America and elsewhere. So Newkirk says that some people such as Victor Schoenfeld object to the work of groups such as PETA, which, while abolitionist and determined to get animals off the dinner plate and out of the fur farms, circuses and laboratories, have nevertheless been working with corporations to achieve animal welfare reforms within their industries. Not only is it possible to work for an end to animal slavery while simultaneously supporting incremental change, moving the bar closer to that goal also seems to us to be an important step. Yes, it is more comfortable for industry and consumers alike, but short of a bloody revolution of the sort history has witnessed in other social movements, it is also nearly impossible to move a society forward in any other way. The vast majority of people, if they care about other animals, and consumer surveys show that they do, they support incremental improvements. It seems obvious that society is more likely to progress in a way that causes particularly abusive systems to be improved or eliminated before full animal liberation is achieved. If society's perspective is that other animals should have no rights or interests at all, then moving from that mentality to complete animal liberation will require an impossibly enormous shift in viewpoint, no matter how much more enlightened this generation is than the last when it comes to understanding the complex behavior and needs of all the various species from dog to duck. Now that some of the world's largest corporations are saying, yes, we understand that animals can suffer, and we see this as a real concern, the discussion has begun in earnest. For those who decry gradualism, the practical philosopher Peter Singer would ask, would you prefer to live in the horror you're in, bred to grow 7 times more quickly than natural, so that your bones splinter and your organs collapse? Or would you prefer to be able to live without chronic pain? Would you prefer to live your life crammed into a small cage, unable to lift your wings, build a nest, or do almost anything else that you would like to do? Or would you prefer to, at the very least, be able to walk? Would you prefer to be hung upside down by your feet and then scolded to death or lose consciousness when the crate you are in passes through a controlled atmosphere stunner? The answers should be clear. At PETA, we completely understand the appeal of battle cries, such as not bigger cages, empty cages, the Tom Reagan slogan, really. But giving a little comfort and stimulation for animals who will be in those cages their whole lives is worth fighting for, even as we demand those empty cages. As for the sexy women in our ads, the silly costumes, the street tableau, and the tofu sandwich giveaways, in a world where people want to smile, can't resist looking at an attractive image, and are up for a free meal, if such harmless antics will allow one individual to reconsider their own role in exploiting animals, how can it be faulted? Any peaceful action that opens eyes, hearts, and minds should be commended, not condemned. Victor Schonfeld's film is a wonderful milestone and provides an excellent education. But there must be a constant, incremental daily effort, not just big hurrahs, or we will never succeed. So, Ingrid Newkirk talks about legal rights and not moral rights, like, for example, Tom Reagan, Joan Denea, or Gary Francione would talk about. And she's essentially repeating themes which she first rehearsed when she was part of a kind of counterpoint article in a magazine called The Animal's Agenda. She entitled her part of this debate, "Total victory, like checkmate, cannot be achieved in one move." She says that vegan-only abolitionists ask for too much, essentially, an impossible shift. In 1992, she said that human beings will not stop harming each other even. So asking them to respect other animals is utopian. And abolition then is unattainable. However, she does say that she thinks that most, but not all, forms of animal slavery are likely to be abolished eventually. In order to reduce animal suffering, she says that the animal movement is effectively forced into regulating atrocities. However, she says that she's heard animal rights advocates arguing for an all or nothing approach, and argues that this is misguided and also very divisive. She says that it's a mistake to reduce the whole movement to a collection of purists. Only dead people are purists, she argues. Many animal welfarists are, she states, her dearest professional friends, and they should be respected. Therefore, in this article and elsewhere, she's prepared to go and bat for them, to defend the vital contribution that welfare reform brings to the animal rights movement. Steps towards animal liberation are steps towards what we want, she argues. Sometimes, she states, we need to be honest and see that philosophy can get in the way of doing what needs to be done to reduce animal suffering. In terms of campaigning, where people are and where people agree is what's important. Some vegans support animal experiments, for example. Some hunters believe that pigeon shooting is cruel. We should come together, she says, where we agree. The animals need both pro-life and pro-choice humans fighting for them. So, she would argue, it actually makes pragmatic sense to give slaughterhouse designers awards. So this is slaughterhouse designer Temple Grandin, who's given an award as a visionary from PETA. She says she really is an animal welfare visionary. It makes pragmatic sense, she says, to work with corporations such as Bell and Evans Chicken. By carrying out a slaughter system that greatly reduces the suffering of chickens, Bell and Evans and Mary's Chickens show that animal welfare and good business go together hand in hand. It is pragmatic win-win situation when companies invest in controlled atmosphere stunning. Now you can see here that PETA are saying controlled atmosphere killing. So this has been a bit of an issue in the movement. A lot of advocates, when they're talking about the new, as it were, pig gas chambers, talk about that's how they're killed. In actual fact, the controlled atmosphere machines are there to stun the other animals, and they're usually killed in the traditional way of being hung up by their back legs and have their throats cut. But she says, nevertheless, all this reduces animal suffering and increases profits, the two things that can work hand in hand. In terms of the stunts or the antics, as she puts it, she says we need to grab the attention of people where we can, when we can. Now, Professor Steve Best would criticize this PETA KKK stunt, But I think Ingrid Newkirk would respond to best with one of his own phrases, which is by all means necessary. Also makes perfect sense to congratulate Whole Foods for their animal welfare standards. So this is not a death certificate for the animal rights movement, as we suggested last time. This is a pragmatic and necessary gradualism. And finally, in terms of completion of the story, FARM was founded by Alex Hershaft in 1981 under the name Farm Animal Reform Movement. Following the pragmatic model, it states that its aims are abolitionist and reformist. Finson and Finson, the sociologists that we've been relying on for this little series, say that their long-term aim is the abolition of animal use. In the shorter run, until people stop eating animals, FARM hopes to bring about better conditions for animals while they are raised, transported, and slaughtered. The other sociologists we've used throughout are Jasper and Nelkin, and they say that the farm animal reform movement ran an annual Great American Meat Out, as it was called, intended to alert people to destructive impact of factory farming practices on animal welfare, natural resources, and human health. Customers were urged to sign a pledge. It was called the Meat Out Pledge, which read, "I pledge to kick the meat habit on March the 20th, which was the first day of spring, and to explore a less violent, more wholesome diet." The pledge text changed a little later from kick the meat habit to explore vegan eating for a single day. And also at some point, FARM changed the R in their name to mean rights rather than reform. So in conclusion then, the animal rights movement today thrives in North America, but it's not a rights movement in any philosophical sense. Rights is used rhetorically in the animal rights movement.
Starting with animal rights, a lot in your work, a lot of your positions about animal rights stems from a notion of equality. So why is equality so important when viewing both humanity and other animals in the animal kingdom?
Okay, before I answer the question, I want to make just one little pedantic point.
Absolutely.
Some of you just heard me say that if we take a rights approach to human rights, it becomes difficult to decide what set of human rights we have. Julie, you talked about animal rights there, and of course the same would apply to that. Do animals have rights? What rights do they have? Although people very frequently describe me as an animal rights advocate, as you just did, and that's fine from the point of view of taking a political stance. People will know what side I'm on, where I am. Philosophically, I'm not an animal rights advocate because I don't think that rights is the appropriate terminology to think about the issue.
The modern animal rights movement is a pragmatic place. One scholar of the movement uses phrases such as animal rights widely drawn in order to include animal welfare groups, such as Compassion in World Farming, under the label animal rights. So, in a sense, the movement has made a choice. It has rejected what you might call camp futility in favor of camp getting things done. A rejection of camp stand aloof in your philosophical ivory tower, say, in favor of camp get your hands dirty. In terms of philosophers as the movement's guiding minds, the animal rights movement rejects rights-based animal rights in favor of practical philosophy, as Ingrid Newkirk suggested. In my PhD, I mentioned that there is a sociologist called Paul Gilroy. In 1987, he wrote a book about racial politics called There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. And I said in my work that, yeah, well, there ain't much rights in animal rights either. However, if the moderate wing of the animal rights movement is right and the abolitionists are wrong, this isn't a problem. The lack of rights within animal rights isn't a problem. We shouldn't see it as such. In fact, in the name of pragmatism, no rights in animal rights might be exactly what we need. And this is why the animal movement is not dead. It is called the animal rights movement. It doesn't matter that it's got no animal rights theory attached to it. It's more to do with using that as a name and getting on with the practical, everyday things that are needed to bring about animal liberation. Okay, people, so that's the little mini-series within the time tunnels about the North American animal rights movement. So if you have not seen the first two, the first really was what Norm Phelps said there about the development, the emergence, where it came from, and then the suggestion in the second program that the animal rights movement in North America was dead, and now today's session, which says, no, that is completely wrong. It's just that we need to look at it in a kind of non-rights kind of way. There's no point in expecting the animal rights movement to be a rights-based movement. That bit is not needed, as it were. Okay, everyone. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.